radical left has taken over the Democratic Party.
Hello and welcome to Think Progressively, covering politics and all the other chaos life has to offer. This is episode 122, recorded on Friday, May 3rd from Milwaukee. I'm Joe.
And I'm Jason.
And on today's episode, we dive into the history of student protests and how today's protests for Palestine compare. But first, the headlines.
I got along with him well, although he did announce the other day that he'd much rather see Biden as president. And I agree with him. I agree.
First up in headlines, we're going to take all you unruly listeners down to the gravel pit. According to her new book, No Going Back, The Truth on What's Wrong with Politics and How We Move America Forward, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, for some reason, tells a 20-year-old story of her family dog, although she later tried to clarify that it was a working dog and was not supposed to be a family pet, a 14-month-old wire-haired pointer named Cricket, who she was training to be a pheasant hunting dog. And in the book, she writes that she took Cricket on a hunting trip with older seasoned hunting dogs in hopes of calming down the wild puppy. Instead, Cricket chased the pheasants while, quote, having the time of her life.
That freaking monster.
And it really would be the time of that dog's life.
Oh, no.
Unfortunately.
Oh, no. Oh, Cricket, no.
On the way home from the hunting trip, Noem writes that she stopped to talk to a neighborhood family. Cricket got out of Noem's truck and attacked and killed some of the family's chickens and then bit the governor. Noem apologized profusely, wrote the distraught family a check for the deceased chickens, and helped them dispose of the carcasses. She writes that Cricket was the picture of joy as that unfolded.
Why would you write it like that? Oh, no, Cricket.
Quote, I hated that dog, deeming her untrainable. At that moment, Noem writes, I realized I had to put her down.
Oh, my God.
She led Cricket to a gravel pit and killed her with a shotgun.
And you can just bet that the puppy just was looking up at her with the
what are we
cutest
doing?
little eyes.
What is this?
What's this?
Fun.
What are we going to do, Mom? Oh, no.
Her bloodlust not yet slated.
Oh, I shouldn't be laughing this much.
Noem also killed a, quote, nasty and mean, and I believe she also called it smelly, male goat that she said chased her kids. So she also tried to shoot the goat, who jumped right before she shot it, and she instead wounded the goat, leaving it to suffer. She had to go back to her truck to get another shotgun shell and then finish it off.
Oh, my God.
I think she shared this story to like show how tough she is and how she can make the tough decisions.
It was all about the tough decisions she had to make. Okay, let's back up for a second.
Well, and also famously, Donald Trump does not like dogs. First president in like 60 years who did not have a dog or any pet in the White House. I think that maybe that had something to do with it. There was also, I heard rumors that people knew about this story ahead of this. Like there'd been a story going around that she had killed a family dog, like in a moment of anger.
Yeah.
And that people saw it. And this was her way of like trying to get ahead of that. If she's going to be the VP, you know, that story might come out.
So that's what I heard too. And I got to just really make sure that we clarify here. So this was not from any investigative journalism or investigative reporting. This was from the book that she released,
which she later called fake news.
Oh my God.
After people were getting upset, she's like, oh no, they're just misreporting what happened. Like, you wrote it in your own book.
You said the dog was having the time of her life and she was the picture of joy.
And she was on the Sean Hannity show and she said, well, if you really want to find out what happened, you buy my book.
Oh yeah.
Instead of like, you're on one of the biggest platforms that you could have to tell your side of the story from not this fake news narrative spun by the woke liberal media
at The Guardian, which she gave the book to.
And instead it's, well, if you really want to find out what happened, just buy my book.
Oh.
So, as you might imagine, this did not go well for her in the realm of public opinion, as she killed a 14-month-old dog that she seemingly did not have the patience to train.
Well, okay, and here's the thing. I don't own dogs. I'm not going to pretend I know what's best for dogs. I have seen a lot of backlash from dog organizations. I think there was like a wire-haired pointer organization that came out against it, saying like, she clearly doesn't know anything about this breed because it needs to take more time to do this and that. Like,
Right.
I
They
know,
even said, like,
I know nothing about that.
her method of taking it out with older experienced dogs, immediately throwing in live guns, hunting, is not how you train a dog for bird hunting. And while I've had dogs my whole life, I have too. And you want to talk about an unruly, untrainable dog? I have one of those. We have not yet taken him out to the gravel pit, though. But I have had dogs my whole life. I grew up with dogs. My dad was a very avid hunter. Our family dog was also the hunting dog he would take with him.
Sure.
When I was younger, we got a English Springer Spaniel. It was about the same age. It was just about a year old, so almost the exact same age as Cricket here. And that dog was not a good hunting dog. Didn't listen to him, would fetch things, but wouldn't give them back, things like that.
Yeah.
He just didn't take the dog hunting. It just stayed home with us, with the family, and just was our pet. And
You didn't just put it down immediately?
Right. Yeah, didn't murder the dog in public.
Oh, no.
With a shotgun. Vets exist 20 years ago. This is still the 2000s.
Oh, and the quote that I have in here is actually from the German Wire-Haired Pointer Club of America. The spokesperson's name is Joan Payton. And this was one of my favorite quotes. I just had to put it in here. I'm not sure which thing she did was stupider. The fact that she murdered the dog or the fact that she was stupid enough to publish it in a book, which is just gold to me. So what are her chances of being VP now?
Well, a Trump administration official has already shared that Kristi Noem is not on the list of finalists to become vice president.
We're just going through all these potential Republican VP candidates, right?
Yeah, just burning through
We
them.
had the Alabama Senator, Katie Britt, who was supposed to be the big-time VP pick, and then she just tanked during the State of the Union. Now we have Kristi Noem tanking. There's going to be no Republican women left.
Definitely a self-inflicted wound, unlike what happened
Damn it!
to
I was
Cricket
gonna say
and that goat.
No! Oh, I'm so upset I was so ready to say that too. Damn it. Up next, we have an update about the Trump hush money trial. And we talked about this a little bit in the last time we brought this story up, where he was potentially going to be found in contempt for violating his gag order. Well, as of last week, Trump has now been held in contempt for violating his gag order. It is now official. Judge Juan Merchan said Trump violated the order 9 times in recent weeks in posts on Trump's Truth Social platform and campaign website, many of which targeted Michael Cohen, Stormy Daniels, and key witnesses in the case. Merchan fined Trump $9,000 or $1,000 for each violation and ordered him to delete the posts. What a punishment.
Yeah.
Got him. We'll bankrupt him in no time. Merchan wrote that New York law doesn't allow him to impose a higher fine than $1,000 per violation, which, quote, unfortunately will not achieve the desired result in those instances where the defendant can easily afford such a fine. He did say a higher fine would be more appropriate for those cases, but since he does not have the discretion, the court, quote, must therefore consider whether, in some instances, jail may be a necessary punishment. He concluded with a warning to Trump, saying the defendant is hereby warned that the court will not tolerate continued willful violations of its lawful orders, and that if necessary and appropriate under the circumstances, it will impose incarceratory punishment.
So did that stern warning have any effect?
Absolutely not.
There was also a second hearing on Thursday for 4 new violations of the gag order. Prosecution was seeking additional $1,000 fines for violations, but no jail time. The judge did not make his ruling at the end of the 40-minute hearing, and the trial was off today, so we will find out next week what the verdict is on those 4.
I mean, come on. What are we doing at this point?
It's the U.S. justice system. Rich people crimes don't matter. For you or I, $13,000 worth of fines for running our mouth would shut us up pretty quickly. But if you're rich, the laws don't really apply to you.
Well, let's stay on Trump for this next one, because while Trump was also violating his gag order, He did a recent couple of interviews with Time magazine where he outlined just how crazy it will be if he becomes president again. During his interview, he was asked if he thought states should monitor women's pregnancies after abortion bans are in place.
Something that a lot of women have been already fearful of, and there's apps and things that could potentially track this and
Like their periods and things like that.
Right.
Well, yes.
So definitely something where the information for a lot of people is already out there, and really something that I guess you should be worried about. Unfortunately, it's crazy to think that half of our population has to worry about the government monitoring you for your fertility.
Yeah, I mean, it's straight up dystopian. That's what it is. And Trump's super sensible answer was,
I think they might do that. Again, you'll have to speak to the individual states.
and when pressed when whether he was comfortable with women getting prosecuted, Trump said,
The states, they're going to say, it's irrelevant whether I'm comfortable or not. It's totally irrelevant because the states are going to make those decisions. And by the way, Texas is going to be different than Ohio, and Ohio is going to be different than Michigan. I see what's happening.
What is that?
That's literally how he ends it.
He sees what's happening, which is
he
actually
sees what's happening.
the creepiest way to end that.
Hey, he sees what's happening. Okay, but in all seriousness, though, this is why we do not buy the states' rights arguments for anything anymore. Because people like Trump and Republicans all alike use states' rights to get around answering actual policy questions that they know are, number one, hyper unpopular, and number two, will definitely cause more damage to people throughout our country.
Well, they make it seem like it's not something that they're actively doing.
Well,
like,
that too.
yeah, well, it's going to be the states that ultimately do it. No, it's you doing it by changing the law.
Yeah, there's not some like ethereal thing called the states out there. It's Republicans. You're doing it. And I can't get over the fact that when confronted with such a crazy question where it's like, do you think women should be prosecuted?
Well, and
your answer
do you
is,
think we
and
should
monitored?
monitor their ovulation?
And his answer is, oh.
It's up to the states.
Oh.
The best monitoring.
He also said during that same interview, by the way, that he would, number one, carry out a mass deportation effort on day one, forcibly removing more than 11 million people.
Which is impossible.
Tell me about it. Installing new migrant detention camps and deploying the U.S. military at the border and inland.
And would completely collapse the United States economy.
Yes. He also said he would fire a U.S. attorney for not carrying out one of his orders to prosecute someone, breaking tradition with the independent law enforcement. And of course, like we talked about before, he said he would pardon over 800 January 6th protesters who have already pled guilty.
I do agree that it's ultimately he should be the one that's responsible for that. And finally, in headlines today, House Democrats pledge to save Republican Speaker Mike Johnson.
Boo!
In a statement from the top three House Democrats, Representatives Hakeem Jeffries, Catherine Clark, and Pete Aguilar said, At this moment, upon completion of our national security work, the time has come to turn the page on this chapter of pro-Putin Republican obstruction. We will vote to table Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene's motion to vacate the chair. If she invokes the motion, it will not succeed. As we said, we are definitely not for this strategy. Democrats should not stop Republicans from showing the American people how unfit to govern they really are. But I will say,
well, it drives me nuts because basically it's like they're saying, well, since we got the TikTok ban passed, we should give a free pass on this one, right?
So the only kind of positive spin that I've seen on this is that they could stick on provisions that they want to get passed. One of which I believe was mentioned, the broadband internet credit that's expired, that they wanted, that they wouldn't be able to get passed otherwise. And there've also been pledges from other Republicans to put forth the same motion after if this one fails, like Matt Gaetz would do it and then somebody else would do it.
Sure.
And that would honestly just give Democrats the ammunition to just keep doing the same thing and keep saving Mike Johnson, but then also shoving in other provisions that they want along the same time and pretty much daring Republicans to, as a whole, vote out their own speaker, which would be fun.
Yeah, but then you have like on record Democrats all voting for the speaker.
Well, that's why you got to make it worth it. You got to put something in there that
I don't know. know. I don't see House Dems doing that. I truly believe the deal was already made. And
that's the other thing is that this was always part of the deal. That Mike Johnson puts forth a bill that Democrats feel comfortable voting for, and then when
the time comes,
when Crazy tries to kick him out, that they have his back. Which I don't like, honestly. Again, we talked about this when it happened, when she first made that motion to vacate.
Right.
That we were all for letting it happen. Do it again. Show everybody how disorganized the Republican Party is, that they can't do anything. They can't even have a Speaker of the House.
Right.
When they have the majority, that they're that dysfunctional.
So leave it to Democrats again to kick their own asses.
M&Ms will not be satisfied until every last cartoon character is deeply unappealing and totally androgynous. Until the moment you wouldn't want to have a drink with any one of them. That's the goal. When you're totally turned off, they've won.
Boy ain't right.
This week, for Fox in the Head, we turn our sights onto Oklahoma, whose Senate just recently, and this is the good thing, passed a bill that would protect kids from getting hit in school.
Only kids with disabilities.
Yeah.
You feel free to beat the non-disabled children.
Well, so, okay, let's talk about this. In Oklahoma, teachers and school staff had the ability to perform corporal punishment on students without parental permission, which is wild to me.
Yeah, I went to a Catholic school and you couldn't do that.
The only exception that law provided was that you could not hit students whose developmental disabilities prevented them from understanding why they'd be hit.
Which is just straight abuse.
Yeah.
Like, that's just like beating autistic kids.
Yes. Then some super woke legislator, Marxist communist legislator, spawned the idea that maybe we don't hit any kids with disabilities. Now, granted, Jason, I think you're right, where the next step should be is, well, maybe we just don't hit the kids.
Yeah, maybe we just look at all of those studies that show that violence does not help discipline children and just teaches them that violence is the solution and that they should be scared of authority.
But we're not quite there yet in Oklahoma. So we're just going to deal with hitting less of the small portion of kids.
Right. Your pool has narrowed now.
Right.
Of the kids you're allowed to beat.
By a little bit.
This is like literally just saying, okay, priests can't rape the ugly kids. That's just not fair. Like, they have enough problems. It's fine if you molest the pretty ones, but come on.
Now, while you think this would be an easy thing to pass, Republicans have been split. Because they just can't figure out whether or not they should be allowed to hit kids.
You're taking away their freedoms.
And just last week, when the state Senate did pass the super woke legislation, State Senator Shane Jett,
of course his name is Shane,
argued in favor of child abuse in a very passionate speech on the floor. Let's listen.
Effectively, we're taking a tool that has been in the hands of parents and in the hands of schools to maintain discipline. And we're removing it from the parent's prerogative and saying, we, Big Brother, the state of Oklahoma, knows what's best for your child, and we're removing an entire motivational tool from discipline in the classroom.
By motivational tool...
Oh, no.
Let's just be clear. He means like a club, like a paddle to beat children.
So, yeah.
That's the tool that we're removing from the hands of teachers and parents, but it's without parental consent anyway.
My job during this entire segment is just to remind you listeners consistently that the discussion they're having right now is whether or not they should broaden protections of abuse during schools from kids with disabilities where they can't understand it to just kids with disabilities. This guy goes so far off the rails that you're going to forget that that's the legislation.
Right. But let's continue.
And this is an erosive and a corrosive element in the United States whenever Dr. Benjamin Spock published a book that said, don't discipline your children, don't spank your children. And a lot of people don't know that. His voice was elevated because it fit a particular agenda. Dr. Benjamin Spock was a socialist who ran for the People's Party. That means he's a communist. Okay? And disrupting discipline and defying Scripture is precisely what the Communist Party and socialists do by increment. Proverbs 22:15. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it from him. So at the end of the day, it's a very simple question. Do you believe the parents have the right, in partnership with the schools, to determine what disciplinary protocols should be put in place? Or are we going to create an entire class of individuals sending a strong message from here? We know better than the parents. And if you have hearing impairment or you're visually impaired, suddenly you're in a class of people that cannot be disciplined. Are we sending a message that we don't love our children? Whoever spares the rod hates their child, but the rod of discipline will drive foolishness from their hearts. There are philosophical principles at play right here on the floor of the Senate.
Are we here in the state legislature going to say that we know better than these parents of whether or not they should be allowed to abuse their children? Yes! That is exactly what we always do.
That's what we already do. That's called Child Protective Services, man.
Who is to say whether or not you should feed your child? That's your decision as a parent.
But are we just come here like Big Brother and tell them that we know more than you?
As it says in the book of Herman, Mecca Lecca High, Mecca Heine Ho.
Also, can we just, for a little bit.
I haven't heard Dr. Spock reference since I was 10 years old, Joe. And I'm pretty sure it was a really old reference then. But he was a communist.
Well, no, hang on. He was a socialist.
But that means he was a communist.
But that also means he's a communist.
Right.
What is it? Shane?
It's the same thing.
Also, can we just take a moment where at the end he's just like, oh, and so what? What if your kid's deaf or blind? What, they can't get beat?
They're somehow protected now? Can't slap them across the face?
They won't see it coming.
They can still hear the, what did the five fingers say to the face? They know.
Oh, no.
And the kids that can't hear it can see it. So I don't know what the problem is here.
This is insanity.
Jesus says beat your kids.
Oh, and again.
The state of Oklahoma says beat your kids.
Yeah. Oh, and I know there's very, very dark conversations we can have about like how religious movements obviously push for beating children, and they have for generations now, and they're still doing it today. And this is the direct consequence of those types of movements. You have crazy people citing a magic book in defense of legislation of beating kids. How can you support this?
This is why we have supposedly separation of church and state. So you don't literally have legislators arguing in a state senate that teachers should be allowed to beat children and using a scripture
as justification for their
as
argument.
like the proof that they're right.
Right. Well, and no wonder I'm surprised. They're still surprised that people are leaving the church in droves when they hear crap like this.
Yeah, it makes not only the state of Oklahoma look bad, it makes all of Christianity look bad.
Right.
So I guess good job, Shane Jett.
God bless you, Shane.
That was really a productive segment, wasn't it? It's hard to get any word in with this clown.
So we talked last week about the campus protests around the country in support of Palestine, and things have escalated since then. Since our last talk, protests have started at over 150 different colleges and universities around the country. Over 2,300 arrests have been made, which is, I call, a pretty historic amount of arrests being made. Conservatives have criticized their efforts by continuing to call these protests anti-Semitic, so much so that the House recently passed a bill to expand the definition of anti-Semitism amid growing campus protests over the Gaza war. That proposal, which passed 320 to 91, so it was bipartisan, but somewhat at least, would codify the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I found a couple of things, Jason, in I will include the link so you can read the whole thing if you want as well. But I found a couple of things in their definition that there were a couple red flags in my opinion. So I want to just go over these. A part of their definition included manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic.
All right, so far,
Not bad.
that is the biggest thing that is being misconstrued currently.
Right. However, they go on by saying denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor.
And that's, you should be able to say, like, okay, the way the state of Israel was created, which was literally kicking out everyone who was living there currently and establishing, no, this is only a place for Jewish people, and
By also subjugating
Right,
an entire
like
group of people as well.
kicking out Arabs, you can certainly say that was racist. And you're not being anti-Semitic by saying that the establishment of the state of Israel was done by racial lines, because it certainly was. And I don't know
Right.
what else you would call that except for racist.
Right. There was another one that said, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis.
Yeah, which is, again, like, if you're doing it, then you should be criticized for it.
Well, and my thought was, fine, if you don't want to use the Nazi thing, I think that can also be acceptable.
South Africa. I mean, that's what's usually used, right? We call it an apartheid state.
Right. Then that's exactly what I was going to go to, is like, it's an apartheid state, it's fascistic, whatever you want to call it. Like, we'll call a spade a spade.
Mm-hmm.
But my concern with that is I still feel like even without the comparison to the Nazis, it feels like the type of definition is saying, hey, but don't actually question or criticize Israeli policy as being too extreme or fascistic.
Well, it's like saying we're immune from repeating the mistakes that were done to us. You're not. You can't be. That's impossible. Like, because these things happen to us, you can't say we're doing it to someone else. Why? That doesn't make any sense.
Right, exactly. And that's my point too. And then the last one I want to talk about, and keep in mind, like, these are just the ones that I'm picking out from this that I have issues with. There are plenty of ones that are not controversial. Like, they make perfect sense of what we would expect anti-Semitism to actually be. But the last one I have here is applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. And this is them talking about Israel. Mm-hmm. And my thing is, okay, so what are we talking about? Are we talking about just humanity efforts? Are they calling general humanity expectations and efforts double standards? Because that's what, again, a lot of this criticism is coming from people who are calling this stuff anti-Semitic, is saying, like, well, no, like, you just think that Israel can, do all this and they just can't, so it doesn't matter. Why would you say that this is just Israel who should be doing this? Because they're literally genociding a population. Is saying that they are genociding a population and that they should stop that a double standard? I don't think so.
I mean, and it's things that it really depends. Like, you could make the argument that what Israel is doing in response to October 7th in Gaza is not entirely different than what the United States did in Afghanistan in response to September 11th.
I mean, I'd agree with that.
It's like, yeah, the parallels are there.
Yeah, and they both sucked for it.
Is that a double standard? Well, no, because I would freely criticize the United States government for their role in Afghanistan as much as I would Israel and what they're doing currently in Gaza.
Well, and
but that's where that would come from, right? That's where that idea and
well, then I'd also argue, but the people who are protesting against Israel's actions are also probably the same exact people like us who would also be happy to criticize the United States' actions. The people who would put America on a pedestal and use this double standard would be the Republicans and conservatives who have a nationalistic tendency.
Mm-hmm.
It would not be the progressives and liberals.
And I have even heard it reported that members of the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, who helped craft this working definition, said that it should not be used in this way for this legislation, that that's not what it was made for, and this is a mistake doing this.
I mean, even on their own website, they say this is like a non-legally binding definition. So they do say that as well. But that didn't stop the House. Protests have even made its way to our own state, Wisconsin, where encampments were started at UW-Madison and UW-Milwaukee. Republican Senate candidate and totally not a stranger who wants you to get in his van, Eric Hovde, tweeted, "Hardworking families should not pay a dime for the loans of the students at these anti-Semitic protests. Will Tammy Baldwin stand with Wisconsin or the woke mob?" U.S. Representative Derek Van Orton from Wisconsin also posted, "Anti-Semitism has no place in Wisconsin. $0 federal dollars." To which one of our other congresspeople, Mark Pocan, responded to by saying, "Only a dipshit would have that take."
And there was some violence in Madison on Wednesday Wednesday.
I think a guy attacked a police officer with a skateboard, right?
The video I saw was the police were there. They had a line, and I don't know what triggered. I mean, I watched the video. You can stare right at it. I don't know why they started pushing forward, but they did. It was like the smallest protester as well that they were pushing, and they pushed her back into a tent. She got knocked over. They kept moving forward, and then there was starting to be like pushback then from the crowd as like they were literally trampling the tents that were set up there.
Sure.
And then fighting broke out, and then at that point, the people who were filming were trying to get back, so you kind of don't see much of what happened beyond that. But that's what I saw from the video that was posted on our local newspaper website. I don't know the story of the skateboard and everything. Like, I assume that might have happened after there was already
that stuff.
Yeah, a melee going on. But what triggered it, I'm not sure. I don't know if anything was said or, what, you can't see anything in the video. And then they just start surging forward, and then that's what kind of sparks the violence.
But you can see how conservatives now are using this as a way to try to defund our universities.
Which was always their plan anyway.
Right.
And I mean, just as a counterpoint, in Milwaukee, there's been nothing. Like, they're mostly kind of ignored, and it's been very peaceful, and nothing has happened, and there's been no issues because police have not been called to clear out encampments. And instead, students are, for the most part, going to classes and then going back to the encampments afterwards, or doing courses online or studying from the encampments, and there's been no issues. So it kind of seems like...
What's the problem here?
the way to spark violence is to get the police involved.
And we'll talk more about that later. In Texas, riot police beat students and used tear gas while making their arrests, even though there weren't any signs of violence before that. Kind of similar to what you were talking about before. Governor Greg Abbott, real swell guy, tweeted out, "These protesters belong in jail." Students have also reported broken bones, excessive bleeding, again, being tear gassed. One video shows a student being tased repeatedly while already cuffed and on the ground. And then another instance at Columbia University where a police officer accidentally fired his gun inside one of the halls occupied by protesters. Luckily, no one was hurt.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about the history of campus protests to see if this is really the sign of the decline of American democracy.
We are degrading the youths.
If as I believe Joe Rogan said earlier this week, if this is all due to the internet, that's the only reason all of these things are happening, that these kids wouldn't know what was going on in the world if they weren't all constantly online. Says internet personality Joe Rogan. So let's look at some history. And heavily features Wisconsin, by the way. A lot of this I did not know.
Good. I'm ready to learn.
So modern campus protesting pretty much begins in the Vietnam War era, the anti-war movement, and that began as student and faculty protests near the end of 1963 due to the government's support of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem, and I'm butchering that name because Vietnamese is very difficult to learn, so sorry about that. And also, this was the start of the ramp up of what became the Vietnam War, where the U.S. was sending consultants to Vietnam by the thousands. They were basically
bombing the hell out of everybody.
Well, they were basically sending soldiers as like before. This is before we had all the contractors that we have now.
Right.
We just send them in. This was kind of the proto military contractor work. Demonstrations grew in 1966 after a change to the draft system opened the possibility that the bottom half of students in their classes would have their draft deferments revoked. Like, you're dumb, go to war. That's what we need in the military. The bottom half of students. University of Wisconsin students occupied an administration building in May of 1966. Harvard protesters trapped Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in a police car and demanded he debate them.
Get him!
Many protests centered around the Dow Chemical Company, manufacturer of napalm, and their recruitment on college campuses. On October 18th, 1967, University of Wisconsin students blocked entry to the campus commerce building where representatives of Dow were attempting to interview job applicants. Take them out to the gravel pit. Police were called, and events escalated into what has been called the first violent campus protest in the country. Way to go, Wisconsin.
Yeah, you get him, Wisconsin. Let's go.
3 police officers and dozens of students were injured in the roughly hour-long skirmish, and that night, more than 3,000 students amassed on Library Mall and voted to boycott classes until the administration permanently banned city police from campus and agreed not to punish leaders of the Dow sit-in.
Now that sounds extremely similar to what we're dealing with today.
In 1970, Richard Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia, further entrenching the U.S. in a war that had no end in sight, as well as taking away draft deferments for undergraduates beyond the end of their current semester, a law which is still in place today. On May 4th, at Kent University in Ohio, after days of escalating tensions between protesters and the National Guard, who had been called after the campus ROTC building had been set on fire on May 2nd, guardsmen were ordered to clear the campus of an estimated 2,000 protesters after a decision was made to ban the rally planned for noon that day. And this was kind of precipitated by the governor of Ohio, who had given a very inflammatory speech the day before, where he called protesters the worst kinds of people in America and insinuated that he would be declaring martial law, thus giving the guardsmen, the National Guard, the impression that they were in charge, which is what they would be under martial law. And that's why they banned this rally, and they felt like they had the authority to do so, though the governor never did follow through with what he said during that taped press conference. You can listen to the whole thing. It was like a radio interview. But that's why they said they did that, even though, like I said, he never actually declared martial law, so they really didn't have a legal basis for doing what they did. The guardsmen, to break up the protest, fired tear gas into the crowd and began advancing and pushing protesters back down Blanket Hill until they came to the football practice field, which was fenced in, and basically gave them nowhere to go and made the guard retrace their steps back up the hill, with some protesters following. Once they reached the top of the hill, for reasons that have never been fully understood, 28 of the 77 guardsmen began to open fire on the students that were following them back up the hill, firing 67 rounds into the crowd, killing 4 students and injuring 9 others. No one who was shot was closer than 70 feet away from the soldiers. Most were over 100 feet away. The reasons given during the investigation after this were that they were being swarmed by protesters, that the protesters were directly on top of them.
Yeah, they feared for their life.
That now, while there is no debate that rocks were being thrown at the soldiers, they gave accounts like the sky was blackened with rocks. And there's no, like, that's ridiculous. There was even later given, it was 11 of the guardsmen said, plus the adjutant general, who was the commanding officer for the Ohio National Guard, said that they came under sniper fire. The FBI investigated that claim and found that it never happened, and that every round fired came from the National Guard. So completely lying about what happened. Most of the guardsmen said that they just were firing because other people were firing. So they slaughtered 4 students and injured 9 others. And these are high-powered rifle wounds. These are very serious injuries. The Kent State Massacre led to protests at over 1,300 college campuses and around 500 campus closures due to student and faculty strikes. Now, you have an interesting article here from May of 1970, so just not even a month later.
I just found this because I wanted to, talk about the framing of the situation, kind of like what you were saying, and the general opinion of the people at the time. It's very easy now, and we talked about this before with like the civil rights movement, how people idolize people like MLK and the civil rights movement, like this was just a bastion of goodness and well-being. Well, no, people at that time hated that movement, and same thing with this movement as well. So here's a couple of different segments from this article, which we'll also link link in the show notes. Much of what is behind the campus uprisings throughout the country is still a mystery. Who actually fomented the disturbances? Who caused the vandalism, the destruction of property? Were many of the rioters under the influence of drugs? Inquiries among those who have been conducting investigations on the campuses of different institutions indicate that while militants have organized major demonstrations, participants in the disorders, particularly some who damaged property, have included individuals who were under the influence of drugs. Many students are innocent victims or dupes of the hardcore, quote, activists. Law enforcement officers are convinced that outside troublemakers have played an important part in stimulating riots, and that habitual use of marijuana, for instance, tend to go along with the excitement of the demonstration begins.
One might call it reefer madness.
And here you go, Jason. The presence of snipers has been suspected on some campuses, and this has caused much concern to the National Guard and the police.
Yeah, when they completely make it up, I imagine it might be a concern.
The American Institute of Public Opinion, publishers of the Gallup poll, which we now still know as that today, recently made a survey in behalf of Newsweek magazine and asked this question: who do you think was primarily responsible for the deaths of the 4 students at Kent State University? 11% placed responsibility on the National Guard, 31% expressed no opinion, and 58% put the blame on the demonstrating students. Certainly, if there had been no disorders on the campus, there would have been no necessity to call in the National Guard. So the sequence of events made it possible for that tragedy to happen.
And if you don't call the National Guard doesn't shoot anyone. So what's your fault?
I was just going to say, like, if you didn't dress so provocatively, we wouldn't have shot you. I mean, this is just pure victim blaming and demonization of college kids protesting for something that they were, looking back on now, unequivocally correct in, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Vietnam War was a huge mistake. I don't think anyone would say it's not at this point.
I bet we could find
the
somebody.
spread of communism, the guy from the Oklahoma State Senate would probably have approved. But yeah, no, just a huge waste of life that was unnecessary and accomplished nothing. But military arms manufacturers made a ton of money.
Right.
It did some good work for Dow.
Right. But I mean, and I specifically just want to keep going back to the framing, is that major news outlets were framing this as these stupid kids who are usually under the influence, I guess, of marijuana.
The Mary Jane.
Who are just being influenced by these supposed outside groups to do these radical actions, which led to their deaths. That sounds extremely similar to what we're hearing today, where I'm still hearing, Jason, about these tent conspiracies. Like, who bought these tents? Why are they so similar? These kids are being duped by these outside agitators. We just don't know who's coming into our campuses. The narrative is almost exactly the same.
And to close out the Vietnam era protests, I have one final chapter of Wisconsin history that I was not aware of. On August 24th, 1970, at like 3:20 a.m., 4 student protesters detonated a van filled with ammonium nitrate.
Oh my God.
And fuel oil outside of Sterling Hall at the University of Wisconsin.
Oh my God.
They were targeting the Army Mathematics Research Center, which was located in the building. The explosion killed 33-year-old physics researcher Robert Fosnacht and injured 3 others, none of whom were involved with the AMRC. The bombing was the largest act of domestic terrorism up until the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which also used a van filled with ammonium nitrate and diesel fuel.
Oh my goodness.
It caused millions of dollars in damages to Sterling Hall and dozens of nearby buildings, but little actual damage to the targeted Army Mathematics Research Center. And in fact, one of those 4 students still remains at large and is on the FBI most wanted list.
Really? Mm-hmm. I never knew that. And this was still in conjunction with the
this was 1970. This was part of the Vietnam protests. They were protesting the fact that the university had this Army Mathematics Research Center.
So just saying, everybody, we're like a month into, we're like 2 weeks into these protests on college campuses. Those people have been protesting for like 4 years.
7 years.
Oh, because
They
that was
started
1963.
63.
You're right. Whoa. Oh, boy. Next, we have the anti-apartheid protests of the 1980s. And we actually kind of talked about this a little bit earlier.
Yeah, we talked about this last week when the organizers, the divest movement, directly patterned their protests off of anti-apartheid protesters because they literally met up together in that summit that we talked about on our previous episode.
Students all over the country protested the apartheid that was happening in South Africa, and their demands were extremely similar to what today's protesters are demanding. Those students wanted their universities to divest from firms that supported or profited from South African apartheid, and they were effective. 155 universities throughout the country divested, and in 1986, the U.S. government also bowed to pressure from protesters and enacted a divestment policy. Now, even though there were arrests that were made throughout these protests, the big difference was back then in this, there was very little pushback compared to what we're seeing today. And that's because many politicians and local leaders did not want to seem that they were pro-apartheid, I guess you can say, so they didn't really do anything. One of the quotes from a protester said that it was basically having all of us push through an open door. There was no resistance at all. And another example I want to talk about, even a little bit more recent if you think those are too old, were the nationwide protests against the Iraq War back in the 2000s. High school and college students staged a nationwide walkout all around the country. Tens of thousands of students from over 300 different schools and universities participated. Anti-war rallies were held, crowds disrupted classes and traffic, and police were called to multiple schools and universities, leading to hundreds of arrests. And I'm going to put that just an absolute ton of resources in the show notes because I found a gold mine of all this stuff. Now, this was happening all while being constantly vilified by conservatives on major news outlets. And back then, it wasn't just Fox News because there were plenty of conservatives on MSNBC and CNN.
Well, there still are today.
Well, compared to today, man, back then was even worse. Because they were all trying to be supposedly fair and balanced and having every single bit of BS they could find put on air.
I mean, you still have Dana Bash on CNN today, kind of saying the same thing about student protesters.
Fine.
It's funny is these are the same people who were probably in the protests during the 60s and 70s for Vietnam that are now like, oh, I can't believe these stupid kids.
I mean, now that you say it, there's actually a lot of really cool research that I don't have at the top of my head right now because we didn't look into it. But I do know that there was a lot of cool historical stuff on the evolution of boomers who came from these protest generations that started these radical movements, supposedly, and they're now just staunchy conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
Commentators on Fox News regularly called the student protesters un-American. Michael Savage once said they are absolutely committing sedition or treason.
Oh, nice to know Michael Savage was always a douchebag.
Right. And Joe Scarborough,
who's on MSNBC today.
Yes, he is. Once said, these leftist stooges for anti-American causes are always given a free pass. Isn't it time to make them stand up and be counted for their views? And one correspondent on Fox News also called war protesters the Great Unwashed.
Probably correct. I mean, to be fair, those tent encampments don't have many showers.
And again, I just want to harken back to the framing and the narrative. These un-American, hateful, stupid, probably under drugs students.
Seditious.
Right. Just causing trouble, and supposedly no one's going to do anything about these kids these days. It's the same narrative said over and over and over again. Arrests were made, damage was caused, and people like Joe Scarborough are screaming that the world is ending.
Well, and they're always on the right side of history.
Again, right. You completely agree. Because just like Vietnam, you can't really make a good argument for the Iraq War nowadays.
Yeah, or for apartheid South Africa.
Right. So what are the key differences between these three protests and now? These are just my opinions, Jason. Number one, I think it is important to recognize that in this particular instance, you do have two marginalized groups of people pitted against each other. I don't think they should be.
It is being pushed as that's the narrative. It's a false narrative. There are just as many Jewish students on the side of the pro-Palestinians,
right,
as there are the pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist.
Right. But I think that's a difference worth noting.
It's certainly being reported that way.
That's why. It's because the people are also, when they're saying that they don't like these protests or that they're calling them anti-Semitic or they think that they're anti-Semitic, it's because of this dynamic.
Right. They're saying that they're bullying and intimidating Jewish students.
Right.
Even though
Jewish students are
there
in the
are
protests.
a good number of Jewish students on the pro-Palestinian side.
Correct. And I would also argue, compared to other protests, there has been an increased militarized police force that is ready to squash any second of protests that are on these campuses. Like we talked about earlier, where in Texas, immediately police resort to violence to put down these protesters. Granted, I also understand that even comparing though to like Kent State, where they literally opened fire.
Right. The Vietnam protests started in like 1963.
Correct.
And we don't see violence until October 1967 here at the University of Wisconsin. So we went for 4 years in the Vietnam era of having student protests and shutting down campuses and blocking all the things that are going on now. But we didn't see a clash with police until it had to do with, a corporation, Dow Corporation, protecting their interests to be able to interview job applicants on campus. That's what started violence on college campuses during protests. And now it happens right away, where police that's their first,
it's the go-to.
Yeah, resort is, we need to violently push back these protesters. We need to clear out these encampments and we need to start making arrests. That is a fairly recent development.
But I don't think we can also forget that political leaders and influencers are also pushing for more violence as well.
That's what we saw with Kent State.
Right. I don't know if you remember Eric Brooks at all. Do you remember that name?
I do not.
He is one of the new crazy people who got onto the Waukesha School Board. We talked about him in a previous episode. Don't worry about it. He's a nobody. But he's been making a couple of headlines here and there because he recently tweeted out saying, "We need an NFL Red Zone channel for police beating the hell out of these idiots. I would pay 100% for that." And just the absolute vitriol and desire for violence on this side and pushing the police towards violent means, I think is something worth noting. There's also heavy pushback from billionaire donors that we usually didn't have before. Multiple universities are having billionaire donors threaten to pull tons and tons and tons of donations if these encampments aren't taken care of. Mm-hmm. We saw that in Columbia, Harvard, MIT, all over the place.
Yeah, the sex pervert owner of the Patriots, Robert Kraft, pulled his endowment away.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, because of the university catering to student protests. I imagine that was between visits to full-service massage parlors.
And finally, I do think it's worth noting that we live in an age of social media. It's easy to not see the violence back throughout history because we didn't have it shoved in our faces every single waking day. We are constantly bombarded with videos of police beating the hell out of students or some random student saying an anti-Semitic slur or something like that. And we are just being literally bombarded with all this messaging and content. And I would argue that while the core principles or the general nature of these protests have been the same throughout history, the way we view it has definitely changed. I would say the amount that we see from like different details has definitely changed compared to before, and the siloing of information where it's much easier to lose perspective from our information on these things, where it's like you can see conservatives finding random things to nitpick and then losing their minds over it, right? There was that viral tweet or sort of viral video, I can't remember what it was, about people who, one of their demands was asking for more pizza, I think from like one of the students, and he was like interviewed and he said that, and now a bunch of conservatives say, oh, these are just dumb kids who just want pizza. Like they're nothing to take seriously at all. They're just idiots.
The coverage obviously is different because it's 24/7, round the clock, nonstop from an infinite number of sources.
Right.
Where you did not have that then. You had 3 networks that you would get your news from, and then you'd have the radio as well. So yeah, you can find, there's cameras in front of literally everyone where you can find these things, where it's not all filtered through spokespeople or official sources. images or things like that. And like where you just read that quote from the idiot on the Waukesha, was he the school board or where he wanted like a gladiatorial, 24/7 cops beating up protesters channel. That's almost what this is, where you can get video from all around these different campuses. What I watched at Madison, there were like 15 people with cell phones and cameras filming what was going on.
Right.
So if that's what you want, like you can get that from both sides. If you want to just be outraged at police violence against protesters, you can nonstop watch video of
that.
Yeah, police breaking up these protests and slamming people on the ground and using excessive force. And if you want to see the excessive force because you think that the police are in the right and that they should, use brutality as a measure to stop speech, even though you say that you're a free speech advocate. But,
specifically on college campuses.
Whatever. But if that's what you want to see, then you can pretty much watch the same video. You just get something else out of it. And that's the age that we're in, that we were never in before. Even what we saw with Columbia, the police escorted out all of the regular media.
Right.
Ahead of them going in to break up the campus protests there. So all you got were everyone with their cell phone cameras, and the actual reporters were not allowed. So that is definitely a difference. You don't have that sanitized view.
And I'd also argue in that same vein, it could also be a good thing too, right? Like the fact that you have people who can all record what's going on compared to in previous times.
It makes it a lot harder to hide what's going on.
And to just stick to one single narrative for the entire country. But the similarities we see between these, the most striking one for me is conservatives and moderates have always disliked these movements and protests. Contemporary polling shows protests back in the 60s were just as unpopular as this one is today. And I'll link those in the show notes as well for you. Another similarity, there has been violence in the past. Now, while the majority of these protests, even in the past, have been peaceful, there has been violence nonetheless. So when you think about the past and how they did it supposedly correctly, you need to remember there was violence, chaos, and unrest during those times as well. Because protests and these civil rights movements are not just a single monolithic type of organization where they all just band together and do the correct thing all the time. Organizing is very messy, and that's what we saw in these other ones as well. Another similarity I would also argue is the constant use of police to arrest these protesters.
Right. Police are the mechanism to uphold the status quo.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's why you see conservatives always on the side of police when it is attacking any kind of attempt for progress. College kids protesting a war, then they're righteous. Then they're the saviors of liberty and democracy. Not so much when they're trying to prevent you from hanging the vice president of the United States or killing representatives in Congress that you don't like, but smashing college kids' heads, then yeah, that's all good.
I'm just imagining that Drake meme where it's him like, oh, and then he points, yeah, I want that one.
Yeah.
Real good stuff for an audio medium.
Right.
And lastly, I just have to hit it one more time. The narrative is always the same. Young, dumb college kids who just don't know what they're doing are causing chaos and disrupting the status quo.
Helped by outside funded agitators, probably communists.
There's radicals, right?
Yeah,
he's always radicals.
China or Russia or George Soros. I don't know why he would fund the kill all the Jews protests, which is what they're painting these protests to be, but he's got to go on the side of the liberals. So,
well, I also saw Mark Zuckerberg was a part of this conspiracy now too. So, same thing. So don't get swept up in all the excitement and chaos with these protests. Don't think these are really that different than student activism throughout generations. And of course, maybe one more similarity that this protest will have to the previous ones as well. You should probably bank on the student protesters because history shows they're usually right.
And shout out to the student protesters. They are putting their freedom, their future on the line.
Absolutely.
These kids are getting thrown in jail. They're being expelled from their schools.
Yep.
This is going to be on their permanent record. it's going to potentially hurt, their future employment for what they really believe in. And that's something that I know for a fact I personally would not have the strength and the courage to do. If I was on a college campus right now, I would join some of the protests, but I would also be going to class too and not getting arrested and removed from the campus. So shout out to them. They're really putting it on the line here. And I mean, as we saw through our history lesson here, you can take things too far. I'm not saying go get a van filled with ammonium nitrate and diesel fuel. So yes, is there a line? Certainly. But sitting down in a building and not moving in order to try to force the university that you give your money to not then turn around and give that money to a government or a corporation that is then killing a group of people is a noble cause. And as we've played out here in history, they've always been noble causes. And I definitely admire that, and I'm glad that we do have people with that strength of conviction and that courage in this country.
Me too.
Thank you for listening. We hope to see you in the next episode. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at ThinkProPod. You can email us at thinkpropod@gmail.com. And remember, when in doubt, think progressively.
Oh boy, you should talk to Kristi Noem.
She definitely did not spare the rod when it came to cricket.
Or that damn goat.
Smelly goat. That's what you get.
It's called making the hard choices in the classroom. Wham! Wham!
And I am personally a bad influence on goats. I taught my brother-in-law's goats the headbutting thing. Like, they didn't know
how to do that
because they were just like little, they were just little kids. So we were over there. There were 3 little ones, and he raised them literally in their basement because
oh my God,
it was cold. It was in the winter. They always have their babies in the winter for some reason over there. But I was playing with them, and I kept doing I do fist bump, but to their head, and I push them.
Sure.
And then they got into that idea, and I taught them how to do that because they were not raised with the other goats
to do that with.
Right. And they would not stop doing it.
Oh no, you're such a dick. That's like the equivalent of teaching a baby a swear word.
Pretty much.